From the studios of the Optimism Institute, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Burke, and in every Blue Sky episode, we'll be speaking to leaders, researchers, and thinkers whose stories and insights will remind us that there is always blue sky above. Sometimes you just have to get your head above the clouds to see it. There are several ways in which I find guests for this podcast. In the case of today's, he had me at the title of his book. It's Sleep Well, Take Risks, Squish the Peas. Talk about a grabber. The subtitle drives the premise of this work home. Secrets from the Science of Toddlers for a happier, more successful way of life. I had to learn more, and I'm glad I did. The author and today's Blue Sky guest is Dr. Hasan Merali, an associate professor in the Department of Pediatrics at McMaster University and a pediatric emergency medicine physician at McMaster Children's Hospital in Hamilton, Ontario. He received his medical degree from Harvard Medical School and his Master of Public Health degree from Johns Hopkins University. He's published more than 25 peer-reviewed journal articles, and his writing has been featured in Science, the Boston Globe, NBC, CBC, and Popular Science. Dr. Merali lives in Oakville, Ontario with his wife and their daughter, who, as you'll soon hear, just happens to be a toddler. I hope you enjoy this Blue Sky conversation with Dr. Hasan Merali as much as I did. Dr. Hasan Merali, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast.
Thanks. It's so nice to be here. I've done several podcasts, and putting optimism together with toddlers is the perfect fit. I'm happy to be here.
I agree. I'm biased, but I agree. We're going to talk a lot about your book because there's so much in there that I want to share with our audience. But I first wanted to start with your background and why pediatrics. When you go to med school, there's a wide range of things you can come out and practice. What was it about kids and pediatrics that attracted you?
Yeah, so when I was in undergrad, I was at Columbia, and I volunteered at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, and they had put me on a pediatric transplant floor with the Child Life team, and that was a hard place to be, but I just fell in love with these children. They are absolutely the most resilient little people. I mean, they were going through the toughest treatments, and in their moments when they didn't have something unpleasant happening to their body, they would just be playing. And that kind of defines them. And I knew that type of energy and optimism and approach to life is something I wanted to be around. And it's been nice. It's been 14 years since I've been in pediatrics. And now I'm here just sharing all these wonderful lessons that we can learn from them.
Yes, and it seems the reason you wrote this book, somewhere in your career, you reached the conclusion, I'm quoting you, toddlers hold the secrets to happiness and success. Was that something that developed slowly as you worked with kids, where you made this connection between the way toddlers behave and how it could apply to adults and what we could learn from them?
Yeah, it happened over time. I'd say over a decade, where I would be pleasantly surprised by their behavior and think to myself, wow, like that was amazing by itself, and they're amazing people. And what if I was more like that? Or what if adults were more like that? And then I started digging in the research about adult studies, using that type of behavior, playing more, laughter. And the data is incredible, as you know. It's this is the path to happiness. And so if we were more like toddlers, how they are most of the time, I think we would all be a lot happier people.
So I loved your book, and when I first read about it, you had me at the title, which I'll share with our listeners. I highly recommend this book. It is called Sleep Well, Take Risks, Squish the Peas, Secrets from the Science of Toddlers for a Happier, More Successful Way of Life. So what you do in the book is you walk through this research and these things that you have uncovered. But I think this sums it up pretty well, and I'd love you to react, and we'll just bounce off of this. You say, quote, toddlers live in a world filled with wonder, excitement, and true happiness, complete honesty, unflappable empathy, little judgment based on your appearance, a drive to be active and eat appropriately, and where your ideas and what you are willing to try are endless. There's a whole lot there. And throughout the book, there's some things that didn't surprise me that you said about toddlers and a few that you did, including one in there about how they eat. So to frame this for us, what age range is a toddler? Because I'm a long way from being one. My kids are grown. How do you define toddler?
So after infants. So infants are up to age 1, and then toddlers are 1 to 3, and then you start preschoolers, which is up to age 5. And although I wrote toddlers in my title, what I'm referring to is young children between the age of 1 and 5. So
Okay,
it should say toddlers and preschoolers. I didn't want to write that out every time.
It gets a little
And
wordy.
so I'm a little more broad in my definition, but the strict definition is 1 to 3 for toddlers, 3 to 5 for preschoolers. And everything we're going to talk about today and in the book is about these 2 age ranges.
So let's go in that quote. So complete honesty. I think a lot of us can understand that. Can you give examples, or how you observed they just tell the truth?
They just say it how it is. I think what comes to mind right now is their questioning ability. Like, they're not hung up like some of us get to be when we're older about, oh, what is this other person going to think of me? They just ask the question, and their goal is to learn more, and that's what they're about. And the other thing that they're really good at, better than I think most other people, is building relationships. And so they'll do all these things that build relationships, and asking questions is certainly one of them.
And I wonder if the things that surprised me. I was thinking about it. I don't know how much we remember being toddlers. It's so young. We remember the teenage years and preteens, and that's when some of the more negative stuff creeps in. So like when you say, well, even complete honesty, judgment based on your appearance, unflappable empathy, those things start to change, I think, when we're older, and we can talk about why. But is that fair? I think some of the reasons these things are so surprising is we just don't remember being that age.
Yeah. Our memories of our own childhood kind of develop after that time. Maybe 1 or 2 things stand out, but we don't have a complete memory of that. But if you think of yourself as a child, it's hard not to smile.
Right.
And when I talk about the empathy that they have, it's incredible. I work in the ER, so I see a lot of little kids with animal bites because they think everyone's their friend.
Right.
And that's hard for us and for them to learn that, but that's how they approach life. They think that about robots. They think that about strangers. And, one of my favorite examples is this great study where there's a toddler paired with an adult, and there's 2 levers. If you pull lever 1, then only you get the stickers. But if you pull lever 2, then both people get the stickers.
Yep.
And so they tell the adult just to pull lever 1. So repeatedly in front of them, this adult is taking all the stickers to themselves.
Yep.
And then they're given the opportunity to choose which lever they want to pull. And more often than not, they'll go for lever 2, and they'll share, because that's just who they are.
Right. Amazing. Yeah, like you say, their natural state is to be kind and generous. Little emphasis on race. And that struck me too, because you'll read sometimes that as a species, we're hardwired to be suspicious of, people who don't look like us. They might be, back to caveman days, they might be from a rival clan or something. But you suggest that when you observe toddlers, it's not a thing at all.
There is certainly some of that. And actually, when I was initially thinking of this book, one of the chapters was going to be that. But when I did dig into it, there is actually a racial bias that is present fairly early on. Not to say that there's not a whole lot of empathy that comes with that. And there are some surprising findings. Certainly, they're not as hardwired as we are later on.
Yep.
But that does exist fairly early on.
And one of the things you do beautifully, I think, in the book is at the end of each chapter, you have what you call toddler teachings, nicely summarized. One of them is a toddler teaching, kindness will make you happier. So you seem to suggest that not only are they just naturally kind, it's part of the reason they just go through their days so happy.
Yeah. And there's a lot of good data for that from them as well as in adults. And so for them, there's this great study where they just had the camera on these little kids and watched them as they did some giving behavior. And so they had a bowl of crackers. And as you might know, crackers are highly valuable, probably only second to stickers for little kids.
Yes.
And the crackers they had their own, and then they were given some extra crackers that were found, quote unquote, by the experimenter. And they asked them to share these 2 types of crackers, the found ones and the ones that were theirs. And they actually got more happiness from sharing their own crackers rather than the found ones. And I think there's a good lesson there for us, because when we give, we know that that activates a type of happiness that's much deeper than, the run of the mill, like buying something or like brief moments we get
Yep.
of happiness. And this idea of giving, whether it be, formal volunteering, charity, or even just these small, simple acts that we can do during the day really activates a deeper sense of happiness for us.
And you just mentioned crackers, so I'll ask you about eating. This was one that surprised me, that they self-regulate the amount of food they eat or need and eat, whereas we as adults obviously struggle greatly with this. Can you talk about that? Because that surprised me. Again, my memories of childhood are like, if you put an ice cream sundae in front of me, I'm going to finish it until I don't even feel good. But you show other research that suggests otherwise, and your own observations.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to how they approach life and how they're so present in the moment. And they don't have a developed prefrontal cortex like the rest of us. So they're not thinking a lot in the future and doing a lot of planning. And so that really grounds them into what's going on right now. And so eating is a good example where they're eating because they feel hungry and they want to play. That's where Squish the Pea comes from.
Yep.
But they stop when they're full, and they're not overeating like what happens in older adults and teenage years, because we eat for a lot of other reasons, because we're bored, we're sad, we're in front of the TV.
Right.
There's social reasons we're eating, but toddlers are eating mainly for hunger, and so they don't tend to eat past their hunger cues, and their rates of overweight, obesity are much lower than the rest of the population.
The first thing Dr. Merali mentions that struck him about toddlers in the emergency department is their resilience. While young and small, they are tough and positive in the face of scary challenges and injuries. I was surprised to hear how many of his patients come into the ED with animal bites. But this makes sense when you hear Hasan describe that toddlers are by their nature trusting and empathetic, default settings that can also be helpful for adults. And quickly, we can see why Dr. Merali wrote this book, because there are so many valuable lessons we can learn by studying the behavior of toddlers, including the notion that being kind to others, like sharing crackers, actually makes us happier. And toddlers stop eating when they're no longer hungry. That's one I know I can work on for sure. Now, back to our conversation with a line from Dr. Merali's book. I love the way you wrote this. You said, they don't share, give, or act kindly to get happiness in the moment. It's more about who they are at their core. As adults, especially I think in today's society, there's so much literature on happiness and how to be happy and, be charitable because it makes you feel good. All these things. You're saying this is just who they are.
Yeah, I'm saying, we can learn lessons from them, but for them, that's not why they're doing it. They're doing it because that's who they are. And a lot of that is evolutionary, because, we're built to develop relationships, and they're so good at that. And kindness is a big part of developing relationships.
And you also said toddlers believe life should be mostly fun with some serious time, not the opposite. And this was one, there are a few points in the book where, you can't help but play devil's advocate, because I'm sure people are going to hear this or read the book and say, well, wait a second. They're toddlers. They have no responsibilities. They don't have a job. They don't have a family. They're not paying taxes, right? All these things So help us understand how we can move towards at least more of that mindset that life should be mostly fun with some serious time, not the opposite.
Yeah, so let me address that point. It's a good one. I hear a lot about the terrible twos, and it's my life mission to get rid of that term.
Yes.
So I'm a pediatric ER doctor, so I see this a lot. Is toddlers coming in with febrile illnesses, and most of these illnesses are 5 days of fever. That is not fun. And most months of the year, like we're talking on average 7 to 10 months of the year, they're getting one of these.
Wow.
So put yourself in their shoes. Most months of the year, you are knocked out for a full work week with a high fever. Like that is
right.
not
that I remember. That I remember. Yeah.
By any means. And I just think of my little daughter, like the world is not built for people their height. And she has a little step stool, which is wonderful, but she literally has to carry this step stool around to go to the toilet, to get something from the counter.
Right.
They have their own challenges. And I think if we were putting ourselves in their shoes and we were knocked out for a week every month and we had to carry around a step stool to do things, I wouldn't think that we would consider that easy.
Interesting. Also, you had some interesting things to say about laughter and humor. And there was a statistic in there or a study that really struck me. This concept of the humor cliff.
Yes.
And it said the amount we laugh or smile drops significantly after 23 years of age. And it's funny because I'm thinking about I never laughed more probably than my 4 years at college, which ended around that time. And then interestingly, doesn't rise again until 80.
Yeah.
And a lot of us around aging parents, there are times when elderly people can be a little childlike in a good way. And I wondered about that, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about why you think there's a humor cliff. Are we hardwired for that? Is that society beating the humor out of us? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
It's interesting. We go off a lot of these quote unquote cliffs, but another one is reading. For example, we read so much when we're younger, it drops off in adulthood. And then a lot of these things like reading and laughter come up again when we're in our 60s, 70s, and 80s. But yeah, I think that one has to do with just the amount of people we're around. Like those years when we're younger and in school allows us to have new and longer term social connections with different people. And as we're going through that still relationship building stage, it helps us use humor in different ways because we're built that way and that we use humor to build relationships and maintain relationships. So I think that's what it has to do with.
Yes, and I respond to that from my experience in organizations. Nothing builds camaraderie like shared laughter.
Yes.
And you've observed that in playgrounds. I mean, that's what toddlers do just right off the bat.
Yeah, and that's what you hear. Like you just need to walk by them, and that's what you hear. And yeah, it's great that you're laughing just thinking about them. And you talked about older adults, and there's such good data because there's intergenerational programs. So if you put toddlers with older adults, it's amazing. So there's even a paper that says more smiles in conversation, older adults and toddlers, something like that, because that's what happens. You get more smiles, more conversation, more fun, just being around them, dancing, more movement, everything.
One of the things, Dr. Merali, I've found in doing this work, when I look for commonalities across people I interview and who are sort of optimistic people, is the sense of lifelong learning. There's always more to learn, more to read, more to understand. And you talked, and it was a helpful reminder for me because my kids are grown now, late 20s, not the age of yours. And when I go out and I'm the older guy and I look around, I see a lot of kids on screens and playing games and watching movies at dinner and stuff. But you say that toddlers love books and they can't get enough of books and they touch them and they want to be read. And I remember this, they will be read the same book 100 times and never get bored. Can you talk about books and maybe even encourage parents that, it doesn't always have to be a screen and toddlers just naturally love books?
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of these things, again, we go off this reading cliff, and toddlers are amazing in that sense because they know so much learning can happen through books, and they're just naturally drawn to books. I was actually just on the Reach Out and Read podcast earlier today. It's just a great one. And I remember my time doing general pediatrics in my training, and part of the well child check with after all the vaccines was getting a book. And so these kids, nothing was more exciting than running to that closet and choosing a book. And like you said, it's special for them, and they need to be off the screens because they engage in what I would term deep reading. And this is a concept that's been written about by Marianne Wolf, who's a professor at UCLA. And it's so important because we're losing that and we're getting to more skim reading. But this toddler lesson of deep reading, I think, is another good one for us because when I sit down with my 3-year-old, we'll start the book. We get a couple lines down. There's questions about this picture. There's questions about this word. We'll get a couple of pages in. Then we'll have to flip back to the other one. And then, like you said, we finally finished this book after 3-4 times as long as it would take anyone else. And the first question is again. And it's amazing. It's amazing. And this type of reading and the amount of reading they do and how they build it into their schedule, especially before bed, and we can talk about bedtime routines, is incredibly helpful for us. And for adults, the data really shows it's correlational, but it makes sense because it activates the part of our brains that are involved in working memory, that it really helps protect against MCI or mild cognitive impairment and the subsequent issue to that, dementia. And so
Sure.
Controlling for everything that we can control for, people who read more have lower rates of those things.
And you've been practicing long enough, I assumed. Have you seen changes in the kids that come in terms of their reading versus screens versus, it sounds like maybe you have in terms of movement towards skimming, but just, coming in with iPads in their hands instead of books?
Yeah, and I have brief interactions now, and I don't practice general pediatrics anymore, but certainly that is the case. There are a lot more screens, and I'm in a setting where things are very stressful, and so I think that's totally fine in those situations. But
Right, the ED, if an iPad's going to help you, that's fine.
exactly.
Right.
But there are
Right.
other fun things that we try to distract them with, like bubbles, and that works well too. But yeah, I have seen this more and more screens.
Another thing you say toddlers are attracted to or just embraces unstructured playtime. And that struck me too. Again, I don't want to sound like the old, get off my lawn guy, but it does seem like parenting strategies have changed and how we raise kids, and things are so much more structured. And, you just don't just go play, you have a play date, or you don't just play pickup kickball, you go to a league when you're 4 years old. What are your thoughts on the values of unstructured play versus more structured?
Yeah, no, I think it's so important because it gets to their sense of exploration and taking risks. And, countries like Norway and Sweden highly encourage that. They have like their kindergarten age kids just go out in the forest. And yeah, they're keeping a general eye on them, but it's not an enclosed, very padded area where there's like one child per adult watching them. And that helps with their learning. It helps with their fun. And the injuries that they get from that are a part of life. They're usually minor. We can take care of them. I think kids should have more unstructured play.
Speaking of injuries, and I don't know if you're familiar with Jonathan Haidt or the work he's doing on kids and social media, more adolescent kids. He's a real hawk for taking phones out of schools and that sort of thing. But one of the things he talks about is all the time on screens and not playing. And it's a weird statistic at first. Like that just seems an odd thing to point out. But he actually showed this chart of adolescents, teens, I think 10 to 15, and the rate of broken bones going way down. And, setting aside obviously things like there might be abuse or something, but like riding your bike, doing something stupid, falling off the swing. He actually is saying that the lower rate of broken bones in these cases is not necessarily a good thing.
No, we need kids to be able to play more, take those risks, build those skills, because that's what they're really doing. They're learning about the world in their own way, and play. They're able to inject that into everything they do. And so we really, I think, need not to limit that very much.
And there's a creative element to it too that I think is really important. Wouldn't it be great if we could mimic the simple priorities of a toddler's life, making ours mostly fun with serious time the exception? Certainly that's a tall order for adults, but responding to Dr. Merali's thesis here, we'd all do well to at least try to shift our balance a little more towards the fun side. And yes, no doubt we have more serious stressors in our lives than do toddlers and preschoolers. But it was a little eye-opening to remember things like fevers all the time and needing step stools to reach things. Life's not always a piece of cake when you're a little one either. Let's talk about the two cliffs that Hasan mentions, the humor cliff and the reading cliff. As I thought about this, I do believe that two paths to a more optimistic outlook are to read more and laugh more. And I suppose that if you can read things that make you laugh, that's a terrific twofer. Next, I wanted Dr. Merali to share his thoughts on the positive self-talk of toddlers. One of the things you talked about, and you cited a video that I have seen, and so it's clearly viral, about self-talk.
Yeah.
And the little kid who's skiing. I saw one the other day too, by the way, and you're talking to me from Canada. This was a hockey goalie, this little kid who was mic'd up for some reason. They must have known he was a character. And the things he was saying to himself during the game, not only positive self-talk, but also just a reminder of just how goofy it all was. It was clearly an organized hockey game and they're wearing uniforms and stuff, but this kid's having more fun. Can you talk about self-talk? Because I think as adults, a lot of our self-talk, frankly, is negative or flagellating, if you will.
Yep.
Let's talk about self-talk. I love that section.
Yeah, so it's good. It's not something people think about too much in terms of toddlers, but they're doing it all the time and out loud. Like they don't worry about what's happening around them, and so they use it for the tasks they're doing, and so they can actually do better in tasks as they're talking themselves through it. They use it for a lot of encouragement, like a lot of, Julie can do it, as I see in preschool, as Julie's putting on her mitts. Um, they don't assign blame, but they just notice things that are off. Like there's a little guy named Colton who's in my daughter's class, and he's looking at his boots and they're on the wrong way, and he says, "Oh, Colton didn't do it right." And so this type of self-talk,
The third
yeah,
person. Yeah, I
it
love
helps
it.
them so much, and there's such a good lesson because there's such strong data for adults on self-talk. A lot of it has been done by Dr. Ethan Kross, who's at the University of Michigan. He's written a book called Chatter. If anyone's interested, it's fantastic. And he shows that put adults in an MRI machine and show them aversive images, and then half the group ask themselves, what am I feeling right now? And the other person asks themselves, or the same person, but they frame it differently, what is Hasan feeling right now? So the third person. And if you talk to yourself in third person, you actually decrease the areas of the brain of emotional reactivity. And so this idea of talking to yourself in either second or third person is really the key. And you talk about this idea that we have a lot of negative self-talk. I think that's an important one too, because the other way to do things is, and this happens a lot at bedtime, we're reviewing the day, it causes insomnia, we're down on ourselves. Talk to yourself like you would talk to a friend. And just that reframing, and you just still talking to yourself, but as you would to a friend, and that could be incredibly helpful. But we just got to get away from this using the word I.
Yes. You mentioned bedtime, and back to things adults tend to struggle with, sleep.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Toddlers don't struggle with sleep, do they?
No, because I'll caveat that with a routine, they do not. And they are people who love routine, and it helps them so much. And we know that, and they know that. And so I think sleep is where it's magnified 10x, because if they're not on a sleep routine, then it doesn't go well. And if they are, it goes extremely well. And so I really love this toddler sleep routine. I think it can help all adults. It's a very simple 3-step routine. It doesn't involve screens like we were talking about. It's an hour before you go to sleep. First thing you do is take a hot bath or shower. That really starts actually the cooling process of your body, which is what we need to sleep. Number 2, toddlers have lotion rubbed on them, and so you can use lotion if you want, or you can do any other hygiene-related activity. And number 3 is reading, like we talked about, and just that 20, 30 minutes of reading, no screens. It relaxes you. It actually will help you absorb the information that you're reading more if you sleep right after. And so it's such a simple and easy way to build that in. And if you can set a bedtime that you're consistent about it, I think it works very well.
I'm smelling Johnson's baby shampoo as you say this, and I'm remembering, probably more remembering using it with my own kids, but maybe even when I was little. But yeah, you just described it. That's pretty much it. Another you point out is they're very good at asking questions, which we all know, but also they're very good at saying no, which we also probably remember, at least as parents, but often we remember it in a negative, right? You have to go to grandma's. Now, tell me the benefits of what we can learn, the benefits of saying no, and how we can learn that from toddlers.
Yes, I think we've all experienced this, of our own adult yes bias to requests that come to us. And then eventually, and sometimes not too long, we get to a point where we're a little overwhelmed. We're looking at our calendar, we're looking at our day. There's just too much going on. And a lot of that has to do with because we've said yes so much. And some of us are not in positions where we can say no a lot, but for those of us who are and have some flexibility, I think there is a very powerful message that toddlers can give us there, because there is nobody who has a more strong no than a toddler. I mean, they'll just look at, the person in authority in their lives who's 3 times the size of them right in the eye and just say no. And I think we can say it in a more polite way, and there are ways we can do it better. But this idea of us exerting our own control over our schedule and saying no is an important one.
It's almost, I assume it's an outgrowth of that just innate honesty that we talked about earlier, right? It's just,
Yeah.
if you ask me to do something and I don't really want to do it, I might say, Hassan, let me think about that again. And there's no way I'm going to do it, but I'm going through all this BS that basically doesn't do you any favors. The kid just says no, right?
Yeah, exactly. They just say no right away. And for adults, the other problem for us is that we, despite a lot of experience, even with the same tasks, we always underestimate how long something will take. And so some of there's really good data, and maybe your listeners want to try this. It's called task segmentation. So you get task X to do, and you're asked to do this. And instead of deciding how long you think that will take, break it down into as many pieces as you can. You don't have to go crazy, but break it down into that is actually 4 different things I need to do. And then put a time estimate on each of those things. And if you do it that way, you'll get a much better estimate on how long this will take. And then the other thing that is actually borne out in the data as well is having a calendar with a much larger view. And the data showed that a 2-week calendar was probably best or minimum. Then you can really see how your day and week is going. And actually, the people who use paper calendars had better estimates of time and getting things done. So something we might want to think about getting back to paper for.
I believe that. Another place we waste a lot of time is sometimes is decision making. Another hallmark you say of toddlers is they make decisions quickly.
They do, and it's part of not having this developed prefrontal cortex, and they're so good at it. I think I wrote that they don't have a pros and cons chart when they're deciding if they're gonna do something. They just decide whether it's a yes or a hard no, and they're guided by learning, building relationships, and empathy, these 3 things. And so most of the time they actually make really good decisions. And that's a good lesson for us too.
And they're also risk takers, which I assume in that sometimes they don't make the best decisions, but they take risks. And then as we get older, we probably are less inclined to do that. How have you observed toddlers being risk takers naturally?
Yeah, there's no one that takes risks like toddlers. And this is another one of those cliffs that we talked about, that we go on and we become more risk averse as we get older. I mean, certainly in my practice, I see it as we were talking about injuries. So a lot of what I do with little kids in the ER is putting casts on fractures and fixing lacerations, because they actually think they can fly, and they're jumping around and pretending to be Superman, which is wonderful in how they're learning. But there's a great lesson there in how we can be taking risks. I think I'd say more in our work lives as well, because taking risks means that you're learning, and not taking risks means that you're not learning and growing. And so that, especially career-wise, of taking these risks, I think can help us grow and learn, not as fast as them, but more like them.
I remember when our kids were learning how to downhill ski, and one of the young kids bragged about, I didn't fall all day today. And the instructor said, well, that probably means you're not learning. If you're pushing and becoming a better skier, you're going to fall.
Exactly.
Right. And you're going to figure out what you did wrong. But that sort of sense of success being not making a mistake can really lead people astray. And it sounds like toddlers don't suffer from that.
Not at all. And the other lovely thing about them is that they just have the confidence, even in the face of these little setbacks. They just keep their optimism and keep their confidence so high. I just have one great example. This is an older study. It's because just to show how this always holds true for toddlers. It's from the 70s, and there's a memory experiment, and there are preschoolers, third graders, and adults, and they're asked to ask, how many cards are you going to recall in this? And they just have to give a number for this. And so adults are relatively accurate. They're optimistic only an extra 6%. The third graders, 22%. They think they're going to do better by 22%. Preschoolers, 147%. I mean, these
Positive
people think they're
self-talk.
amazing.
I got this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And if you take this a step further in multiple other studies, and you show them, like, okay, you didn't get this, this is what happened, this is what can happen, all these things, they'll still be highly, highly confident in their abilities. And also that extends to other people. When you ask them, oh, how's your friend going to do? They think they're going to do better than they actually did too.
Yeah.
Which is wonderful.
Well, it's interesting you say that too, because I suppose this would be a whole other study, but the higher that percentage, you could argue you might actually perform better. If adults believed more in themselves, right, the actual results might be better.
Yeah, I'm certain that we could. That would really help us. And we have this thing, actually, when we get to be experts in our fields, we actually get a little bit more underconfident again. And
Right.
yeah, it's sad. It's not something that toddlers do. My 3-year-old, she is so fun to wake up because she's a little sleepy-eyed and gives me a smile when she wakes up. But eventually she makes it down to the ground and she looks at herself in the mirror and she just goes for it and just a big high five. And that is the level of optimism and confidence that she has, is just giving herself high fives in the morning every day. It's just, yeah, it's amazing.
If you haven't seen the video of the little kid snowboarding with positive self-talk, you should check it out. And this idea that we should talk to ourselves as if we're a friend is both simple and helpful. And any parent who has raised a toddler knows how frustrating it can be when they're in their no phase. But it's interesting to note Dr. Merali's point that cultivating our own ability to say no can be extremely helpful and is something else we can learn from little ones, even when they're getting on our nerves. Embracing risk-taking and quick decision-making are other toddler attributes worth emulating. And since so many of us struggle to get a good night's sleep, it's helpful to remember those pre-bed rituals so many of us had ourselves or provided to our kids when they were little. A hot bath, a book, and sleep. A simple but effective formula worth remembering. And now, the final segment of my Blue Sky conversation with Dr. Hasan Merali. You mentioned confidence. I've heard this. I'll get this directionally accurate, I think, but a study or just observations. If you ask a room full of probably, I guess, toddlers, raise your hand if you're good at art.
Yeah.
Every hand goes up. Ask 6th graders, raise your hand if you're good at art. And very few hands go up.
Yep.
And the conclusion of the person I heard say this is not so much that they got worse at art. Either someone told them they were bad at art, right? Or it wasn't encouraged. They don't have fewer skills in 6th grade than they did when they were toddlers. They've just lost confidence for whatever reason.
I love that so much. It's so true. And what we're talking about is getting that confidence back, or maybe taking those risks. And as we take those risks and as we get a little bit better, then that can build confidence too. So
right.
I think those two things tie in so well together.
So this dovetails with my next question that I'm sure a lot of people are thinking. I know I was when I read your book. How much of outgrowing these attributes, these positive attributes of toddlerhood, are biological? You mentioned prefrontal cortex, brain related, versus sort of the pressures or the pushbacks from society. Is that a fair way to ask the question? I'm just curious to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, hard to completely quantify, but certainly a lot of it is our brain development. And, we have evolved to, not go near big animals as we get older, because we know that they're not our friends. And we need to be planning things for the future so that we have enough food and other things in our lives. And so some of it is the way our brains are mapped out. But I'd say on the flip side, just like toddlers are able to make all these neural connections faster than anyway, our brains continue to rewire. And so we, us in the wellness spaces is why we're doing this, because we actually can change the way we think and the way we act. And so that's why I think it's important, because our brains are always remodeling and making new connections, that we do things that will help us. And acting like a toddler is one of those things.
And a similar question, from my research, you've worked all over the world and often in more impoverished settings, Cambodia, Tanzania, Uganda. Are toddlers wherever you go, or are there societal differences, cultural differences, and maybe even, affluent versus not so much? Do you see from your work, either anecdotally or is there research to suggest differences, or a toddler's a toddler?
Yeah, no. So a toddler as a toddler in terms of how much they love life and are confident and laugh, those types of things. But I will say, getting to your question earlier, what I have seen quite a bit is this overprotection that we have here, and controlled environments where, little kids start to have a lot more responsibility in the other countries that I work in. And they'll, the 5 and 6-year-olds will start caring and helping with the 2 and 3-year-olds. And that's something that really wouldn't happen here. And even the older children are carrying the babies on their back when they need to, and helping with household chores at a much younger age. And so there's more, I think, of a sense of this helping the family and sharing the tasks than we have here.
And also, I would think a lot more in some societies, intergenerational interactions, grandparents living under the same roof.
Yes.
And that sort of sharing, which I think my sense is there's huge benefits going every which direction.
Yes, it's so important that you mentioned that. That is, yeah, so cultural, and it's a very natural thing, and it's a little bit unnatural here. But when we've done it, we've seen incredible benefits. There's one in Seattle now. I know there's a couple in UK and in Australia. And if listeners are interested, there's an excellent program originally from the UK and now in Australia called Old Folks Home for 4-year-olds. And they have an intergenerational community with a preschool, with a seniors home together, and they eat together and they do activities together, and it's the cutest, sweetest thing. And you can just see, hopefully, some of the things I'm talking about of how toddlers just bring out this love of life in other people just by being around them.
Now that your book is out and people are reading it, what kind of feedback are you getting? Any surprising feedback from people, or as you do shows like this, questions you didn't expect, or unintended outcomes or responses to the book now that it's out?
I think that some of the best feedback I've gotten is how useful toddler behavior is in our working life. I split up my book into 2 parts, and the first half is more about life in general, like laughter and play, and the second half is really how are these lessons helping us at work. And it's, I think, not what people think about as business leaders. And so that's really been the most helpful feedback, that yes, this is correct. This way of acting in a team, for example, I think that's probably the most important one, is a good way to go. We need to be having direct communication, and we need to be assigning less blame and talk about we when we talk about projects. And how do we leave a project respectfully? And all those things I put in the book, and the way toddlers do it is, I think, the best example.
For me, that really broke through as well, because, and it might just be my nature, but I've always believed as a leader in businesses, or someone working in businesses, that people do their best work when they're enjoying each other, they're having shared laughter. There's that old expression, you're only young once, but you can be immature forever. I've always appreciated that, probably more than I should. But even like the quick no. I worked for Ted Turner, who, talk about a guy who says exactly what's on his mind, and it might upset you on occasion, but you never waited for a decision. And you never wondered, you can deal with people, especially powerful people sometimes, I think, where they say, oh yeah, I love you. Yeah, I'll get back to you. Yeah. And then you leave and they roll their eyes and they're like, what a waste of time. Ted, if he's thinking no, he says no. And there was something so refreshing about that, and efficient. You didn't wait around. You didn't wonder, you knew. And I think if there's so many, I'm glad you brought that up, because I hadn't focused on it much in my questions, but I think what you talked about in the work environment is hugely valuable.
Yeah, yeah. And there's other things we can do just to make our workplaces better. Like even the play aspect, if we did a little bit more of that at work, it would be so great. There's another great study I'll just mention briefly. This is from Sweden, and they have 18 different meeting groups, all these different types of people in different businesses. And halfway through the meeting, the researchers just did one of 2 things on the table. They didn't talk to anyone or anything. They just put either dark chocolate and fruit, and then the other one, they put one of 4 fun items, like a stick-on mustache, foam dart guns, or like instructions for a game that everyone had to say, life is wonderful, and raise up their hands if someone touched their face. And so that's all they did. They just put these on the table. And at the end of the meeting, they went back to these people and talked about the meeting, and found so many interesting things. There was more collaboration, openness in the meeting, openness to new ideas, participation, just that simple thing of adding a little bit more play into a serious business meeting can actually help the meeting in business terms.
Totally believe it. And the other thing my observation would be that this is not necessarily, what you've written is not necessarily, it's not a parenting book. But if I were a parent of toddlers, I think there's a lot I could take from it, because depending on the parent, like we talked a little bit about hovering before, or structured play. And just in general, sometimes I think, maybe more today than in the past, we want our kids to grow up quickly, or we want to maybe take out some of the toddler, right? Because we're all about achievement, and don't stop saying no all the time, or all these things that you talked about as positive. Sometimes I think in our parenting, we might push back against them. Is that fair? And is that something you hope people get out of the book too?
Yeah, definitely. I always put this disclaimer in that it is definitely not a parenting book, and I offer no parenting advice in this book. And I have one 3-year-old who, yeah, I think she's doing great, but I'm not sure. I hope so. Our pediatrician says I am, so that's good.
Right.
But yeah, I think parents have a unique perspective on this because they're seeing it in the moment, and they're able to, I hope, like you said, appreciate those things. That strong, powerful no that you're getting back is actually a wonderful thing. And what I want parents and everyone to do is learn from that and not push back against it. What am I not doing? Why am I not saying no like that when I need to be?
And I would say too, as someone who can barely remember when my kids were toddlers, and I'll say it to you, and you've heard it from other people, enjoy this time while you have it. It goes quickly. There's nothing more fun than a 3-year-old, 13, not so much. And so, almost as a parent, embrace the toddler in your child and in yourself. And I think everyone is better off if you can do that.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. It's such a lovely time. And one of the things I think people can do also is just have these little reminders of childhood as well. And I talk about in my conclusion of the book, even just a photo of yourself as a toddler can help you just get into that mindset of what you were like, even if you don't go all the way back to there, just childhood you and the things you used to do or want to learn about, and the reading and the laughter and the play, and just getting a little bit of that back into our lives is incredibly helpful.
Well, the name of the book, once again, is Sleep Well, Take Risks, Squish the Peas, Secrets from the Science of Toddlers for a Happier, More Successful Way of Life. Dr. Hasan Merali, you have written a fantastic book. I really thank you for all you're doing and for taking the time to be on this show. I hope you sell a ton of copies. And I know when people get it, they're really going to enjoy it and get a lot from it. So thank you very much.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate you giving toddlers a platform to do this.
You got it. Take care and best of luck with the book.
Thank you.
It's interesting to hear Dr. Merali say that in our culture, we probably overprotect toddlers and don't allow them to take the risks that will help them learn. I also liked hearing that people say his book has helped them rethink not just their personal lives, but also their work life. I'm a huge believer that people do their best work when they're having fun, and there's no better bonding tool than shared laughter. And the interest in fake mustaches over food doesn't surprise me at all. And to put a smile on your face, pinning a picture of yourself as a toddler on your refrigerator or office wall might not be a bad place to start. I hope you enjoyed this blue sky conversation with Dr. Hasan Merali. Before you go, we'd appreciate you leaving us a rating or review, and hope you'll consider subscribing to our podcast to be sure you don't miss any future episodes. This and all Blue Sky episodes are made possible by the incredible editing and mixing done by the team at Sound On Studios. You can learn more about their work at soundonstudios.com. All graphic design and cover art for Blue Sky and the Optimism Institute are provided by Crush Graphics, and that's Crush with a K if you'd like to check out more of their fantastic work at crushgraphics.com. Until next time, I'm the founder of the Optimism Institute and host of Blue Sky, Bill Burke, and I thank you for listening.